Hitler was a beginner compared to the comic book industry. Frederick Wortham. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you. Hi, I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa. And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is season 5, episode 4, and we are beginning a new series on new media horror.
Well, that quote that I read at the beginning, if you're not familiar with the name Frederick Wortham, perhaps you might be familiar with the name of the book that he wrote. It's a fairly... I can't find the word that I'm trying to think of for it, but it's a well-known book. It's called Seduction of the Innocent. And if the quote wasn't a giveaway, well, this whole episode is going to be dedicated to something that we haven't really talked about a lot, what we're kind of just dubbing new media horror. And this episode is going to be devoted to comic books and, how the horror genre has played out in them since their, inception and whatnot. So I guess being the resident comic book nerd of us three, I will probably be the one to start us off here. Comic books are great. I love them. They're fantastic. And, horror is one of those really interesting things that I think, it can live in so many different media forms. You've got what we talk about typically, which are novels and short stories and movies and those sorts of things. So you've got a very visual medium, you've got a very literary medium, and I think comic books kind of sit like right there in between the two, where you've got the words on paper of literature, but you've also got the images and imagery of movies and cinema kind of melded in together. It's not moving, but you've got the pictures right there with you. And I will definitely be the one who is defending comic books against people who are purists and want to call them not high art. I think that's kind of finally died down now that they're a lot more accepted in the mainstream these days. But for a long time they were a kids medium, and nobody thought that they were worth examining as art, which I think is ridiculous. I think some of Neil Gaiman's best work is his Sandman comic book series, for instance. So, sorry, I'm about to get onto my soapbox about why we should study comic books at the same level as novels, short stories, and film. So, Mel, Lisa, what are your experiences with comics and general, or as they pertain to horror, before we kind of dive into the meat of the episode?
I came to horror comics and really comic books in general. I came to them fairly late in my reading career. So I still consider myself a little bit of a novice when it comes to this. Only because I don't really know the history of it, and I'd love to know more of the history of it. I would really love to dig down into that, but it probably started for me. I don't know, maybe about. Trying to think how old my oldest son is, because this would tell me when I got into it. So he's about 8 years old. He's about to turn 8 years old, and I started reading horror comics when he was an infant because I didn't have the stamina to read books anymore. I was just tired because I wasn't sleeping because I had a newborn. And anyway, so I started reading some of these horror comics. I have a friend of mine who is really into it, and she shared some things with me. But one of the first ones that I read that really kind of got me excited about it was Preacher. And so it was shortly before the TV show. I don't know when the TV show came out, but I was reading these a little bit before then. And I was very excited with what I was reading because It was so, the story was so good and the characters were so good. But I also liked, and this is okay, this is what I will say about comics. They are able, I think, to push the boundaries further than sometimes TVs and movies can. And I think Preacher is a really good example of it. And I will go ahead and say that I have not finished the TV series, so I can't tell you what really happens and the differences there. But I know that the comic series goes into some really bonkers, bizarre places in really wonderful ways. And there was a lot of stuff as I was reading that I was like, oh my gosh, this is so gross. Oh my gosh, I can't believe they did that. I need to read more. And I started seeking out more. And so I got really into horror comics for a while, into different series after that. So I don't know probably as much as you do, Matt, about the subject, but I'm really into it.
Oh well, Preacher definitely is in my like top three best series of all time. Like Sandman, I've already mentioned Preacher, and those both I think. I hadn't originally thought of Preacher as a horror comic book because most of it is, I mean, it's not scary per se, but it's definitely, I mean, one of the main characters is a vampire, and the other one has like the love child of an angel and demon stuck inside of him, and none of this is spoilers. This is like issue 1 and 2 kind of thing. So, uh, yeah, like I mean, it definitely I think fits within horror territory, especially what Garth Ennis does with it. And I mean, I'd say Sandman could kind of, especially some of its stories, could also fit, but it's so hard to categorize those two
It
in general. I mean, they like you said, they straddle genres as well as push boundaries. But oh yeah, I love Preacher. I've only seen a couple episodes of the first season of the show. It's not that I didn't like it; I just didn't have the time when it first started airing to really sit down with it, and it didn't hook me. And so, if I had really gotten invested in it, that would be one thing. But so I have no comment on the show as it is. I do want to watch it eventually, but well, what about you, Mel? Any any comic stories?
Um, I'm very similar to Lisa in the fact that I didn't when I was growing up. I don't remember reading too many comics. If I did, I might have read like a couple of superhero comics, but it wasn't really a thing that I was really into. I think it was partially because like bookstores I would go to, and when I would go to the library, they weren't like I didn't really see them. So yeah, it was probably. I think I started reading comics and graphic novels in graduate school, probably. So yeah, the last 10 to 15 years or so. Um, and a couple of them I stumbled on just because of my research. So, because I was doing a lot of reading in supernatural detectives and occult detective stuff, I stumbled upon, uh, which I think I've talked about this before, the death defying Dr. Mirage, which apparently was like a reboot of a character from I guess it would have been in the 90s. I'm not sure, but this particular version, the Death Defying Dr. Mirage, came out several years ago, and I enjoyed that. I mean, it was about this woman, Dr. Mirage, who can speak to the dead, and she does investigations for people, and she ends up like this occultist gives her this object and she goes off on this crazy mission to the underworld. It was entertaining. I also stumbled upon the 1970s The Occult Files of Dr. Spector, which I recommend for pure entertainment value. It has issues, but it's fun and entertaining, and they did a reboot of that actually a few years ago, which I picked up an issue, but I have not read it yet. It also led me to a friend of mine put me on to the Beasts of Burden, these animals that investigate supernatural doings. And I think I've talked on the podcast before that I started Lock and Key. I still need to get back into it and finish the series. And I really enjoyed the first volume. And then I've read all of Paper Girls, and I just bought the final volume, volume 6. And I'm looking forward to sitting down with that probably over the holiday break and finishing up Paper Girls, which I loved. I think I've talked about that a couple times on the podcast. It's like Stranger Things with only with gang of a group of girls that go on all the adventures. So those are just a few of the ones that I've read or am reading.
Nice. Yeah. Lisa, you've read Lock and Key, right? Or
I
have you?
love Lock and Key.
Okay, good. And
um,
for those listeners that may not know, Lock and Key was written by Joe Hill, Stephen King's son. So just wanted to insert that comment there. Go ahead, Lisa.
no, I was just gonna say that I think Joe Hill possibly shines brightest when he's doing graphic novels or comic books or whatever you want to call them. I mean, I like his novels. I like his just straightforward horror novels. I really enjoyed Horns. Um, but Lock and Key is so good.
It really is. It really is. Can't recommend that one enough. So, um, well, yeah. So I guess we're kind of all approaching this from very different backgrounds with comics and whatnot. So, have either of y'all read any of those old pulp comics from like the 30s, 40s, 50s? Have you ever? I mean, you've probably seen the covers of them at
I've
least.
seen the reprints, but I have not read them. I'm familiar from like people my parents' generation talking about reading when they were a kid, the retelling of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and the Poe stories and Bradbury stories, and then Tales from the Crypt, of course. But I don't know. I haven't read them. I just have seen the covers.
No, I mean, all of my comic knowledge comes from things that I mean, Preacher might be the oldest one that I've read.
Gotcha.
From like 90s.
Wow. I mean, I've read 70s one, so.
Yeah, I mean, no, I haven't even, I've been wanting to, but I haven't. All of mine have been pretty recent, like Nailbiter and things like that I've really enjoyed reading through. But I, yeah, I'm kind of embarrassed to say to say that, but yeah.
Well, I think it's worth diving into the history of them, like throughout like the early to mid 20th century, just because I mean you're talking about comics with Preacher and up through now pushing boundaries. For a long time they didn't, and it's because of these old like pulpy things like and Tales from the Crypt would be the most famous one, also because it was kept alive as that HBO series with that was the horror anthology series as a TV show. But it started out as one of these. I mean, it was apparently like really starting like I guess kind of post World War II in particular, like in the 40s into the 50s, like they were everywhere. Just horror comics. They were superhero comics and horror comics, and they were so like they were grotesque, a lot of them. I mean, go look up some of these listeners, like go Google some of these like the EC comics, EC being one of the publishers. They I mean, yeah, they've got some pretty gruesome looking covers, especially when you think about, what else the 50s is known for, which is the stereotypical nuclear family sitcom of, fathers knows best. I think it really is this wonderful flip side of what's happening in the culture at the exact same time, where just like the Victorian era, you've got these straight laced culture, but there is this undercurrent of craziness that's happening. So, I mean, I would say that it was a good outlet for the things that people were trying to repress. But so historically, I think it's time to bring up the quote that we began this episode with from Frederick Wortham. May he rot in hell eternally. Sorry, I'm not opinionated on him at all, but um, he I mentioned already the book that he's known for, Seduction of the Innocent, and he was a psychiatrist, and his theorization was that exposure to these sorts of things, and it wasn't just limited to comic books originally. Like he also talked about television and moving pictures, as it were, and he was one of the early people talking about the amount of violence that a young person is exposed to. And I think he had a quote that I saw that would say, people people on TV and in the moving pictures carry a gun like they would an umbrella, or something like that. Like, and so he was one of those ones of, okay, art or life imitates art. All this stuff is going to influence these impressionable young minds. And but what really he ended up fixating on were comic books, and Seduction of the Innocent was what was used around the same time. It was pre-McCarthy hearings, so it was before like the big Red Scare, but it was in that same time where everyone was clutching their pearls essentially about everything. And this was like a cornerstone of this congressional inquiry that led to the Comics Code Authority, which anyone who's bought a comic book, well, I'd say over the last 15 years or so, you may have seen it less, but I remember growing up, like I grew up reading Marvel and DC mostly, and like I started out mostly with DC, and there would always be a little stamp that said approved by the Comics Code Authority. And that was the comic book industry's attempt at self-regulating. They said, okay, we will create this Comic Code Authority, and we'll dial back on all this stuff. It's a lot like the parental advisory stickers on albums by the music industry. It was the same sort of thing of we'll self-censor somewhat. But the parental advisory stickers was just a warning sticker saying, hey, there's explicit lyrics on here. The Comics Code Authority, like, they reined things in so much that like most of these horror imprints, like the publishers, went out of business within a year or so because the guidelines were so strict. Like, if you think of like Batman from the 60s and how campy and goofy and corny it was, that was kind of where all comic books were as a result of the Comic Code Authority, because you couldn't, like, they wouldn't let anyone just step out of line at all. It was crazy.
I have been, this is going to show my ignorance probably to early comics, but I'm going to ask it anyway. When you mentioned, see, I didn't even know that there was like a code of conduct with comics that they had to pass. And so number one, thank you for giving that kind of history, because I had no idea that was going on, although it doesn't surprise me, because when I think of being young, and the comics that I saw that were, I guess people read around me, that might have been laying around or that I occasionally saw in the stores. It was always like Archie comics, because those were always in the supermarket line. And it always seemed to be like right at my eye line. And I remember picking those up, and that would be the first thing I went to when my mother would go grocery shopping, and I'd sit there and read them until she was done, and then I put them back. And then I know like superheroes, right? Like Superman and Spider-Man and, all the Marvel and DC, I guess, big shots. They're the cast of characters. But is that why they were so prevalent? Was because, like, when I think of comics, I think of like the epic battle of like good versus evil. And is that why? Because the other things were not allowed. And so it was kind of like, if you're not fighting bad guys and promoting, truth, justice, in the American way, then you were not getting published.
I'm definitely not like an expert on comic book history or some fountain of knowledge, so I don't want to get the chronology out of order. But I mean, I think that's a part of it. I mean, superheroes, Batman, Superman, they were created in the 30s, so they predate all of this. But really, the censoring of all the horror comics, which, when I say they were everywhere, I mean they were super popular. They were, especially among kids. There were a lot of them. When they pretty much all disappeared practically overnight, yeah, the vacuum that filled in was good versus evil, Superman, saving the day, all that kind of stuff. I will say, like, and I think that's part of where comic books got the purely for kids kind of labeling, because even by as early as the 70s, you saw the Comics Code, like the Comic Code Authority, loosening up. for about 20 years they were like, you're not gonna do anything that's not, prim proper and towing the line. But by the 70s they had loosened up, and so starting like with oh, I don't know what came first, but there was like Swamp Thing, and I think Tales from the Crypt might have gotten revived as a comic around that time. Um, so there were horror comics starting in the 70s and into the 80s. Um, but yeah, I think that I mean, when we think comics, that's what everybody thinks of. I mean, especially these days with the huge success of the Marvel movies, which, nothing against them, they're great, but they really do at the end of the day kind of have that same sort of thing. I mean, they play around with it a lot, especially the interactions between Iron Man and Captain America. But yeah, I mean, I'd say that's the comic code is a. I mean, that's really where Archie came from. Like Archie comics are, and nothing against them. I loved Archie comics as a kid. There's been a fairly recent reimagining of Archie that's really good too. Uh, but yeah, Archie. I mean, that's not something that like quote unquote serious comic book people would you know um, think of first when they're talking about the good comics. That's one of those campy lame ones, I guess.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And when I was reading some of this history that you'd shared with us, Matt, I just thought I thought it was really fascinating that horror might be too strong a word, but like supernatural or horror type characters were appearing in like superhero comics. So like one of the things I looked at mentioned something about vampires appearing in like an early Batman. And one of the things that I read was talking about a character called Dr. Occult who would fight like Satanists and stuff, and was created by the people who created Superman, apparently. And then it reminded me of an article I read, oh man, over the summer, I guess, about how um, superhero movies in the future are possibly going to get like darker and have more like supernatural tinges to them. Like there's always they were talking about how there's always been this tension between the superhero or the Batman type character, but there's also these the Benedict Cumberbatch guy, was it Doctor Strange?
Yes.
um, and Dr. Colt and all these other people who have been kind of pushed off to the side, or the vampire dude. And now their stories might get put more in the superhero one. So I thought that was interesting. The blending of genres that was taking place in the 30s, and like we're still talking about that. Like these supernatural or horror type characters kind of infiltrating those stories.
Well, definitely. And I mean, if you want to talk about one of the first comic book movies of, I would call the modern comic book movie eras, because they've been trying to make comic book movies forever. A lot of them not so great. Go watch the Batman movie from the 60s. It's just like the Batman TV show, which is its own thing, but great is not a word I'd use for it. But one of the very first comic book movies in the 90s was Blade, which is, the vampire hunter who is half vampire and everything. And actually came to light that my wife had never seen Blade, and they were on, I think, Amazon Prime or something this summer. And so we watched the first one, and I was like, how have you never seen Blade? I mean, it's not a great movie, but it's a fun movie. But yeah, there's a lot of blending of genres, definitely. And I mean, the original Swamp Thing that was, by the way, do you both know who wrote the original Swamp Thing? Like before, like who created the character and wrote the series for a while?
Ellis.
Yeah.
Who? Oh, you
we
said
don't know.
Oh, it was Alan Moore of V for Vendetta and Watchmen fame. Like, yeah,
Nice.
a name I recognize.
Yeah. League of Extraordinary Gentlemen.
League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Yeah, he like that was Swamp Thing was his first like major thing that really got his name known out there. And I mean, his Swamp Thing was much like his other comic books, weird, a little grotesque, a little horrifying, and brilliant. So I've only read a few of his original Swamp Thing stories, but I mean they're definitely like fit up there with horror because I mean the whole premise of a man being turned into like half plant thing and there's the love story thing that I can't remember the original story, but I know he was a scientist and his wife thinks he's dead, and he essentially is pretending that he's dead because he was turned into this swamp monster thing. So I mean, there's this whole thing of it where I mean, it definitely slides up there with like the horror genre for sure.
Yeah, I definitely need to read the Swamp Thing comics. That's been on my radar for a while, and I've just never sat down and done it.
And again, not all of the Swamp Thing comics are good, and but definitely Alan Moore's run on it and is supposed to be just like legendary, right along with like pretty much all of his other comics. Which, like, if you've never read V for Vendetta or Watchmen, what are you doing? Go like hit pause. We'll be here when you come back. Like go read those comics. Neither one of which I would consider horror comics by any stretch of the imagination, but they're excellent and well worth reading. Um, but yeah, like one thing I kind of wanted to mention too, because I don't want to focus too much on the 80s, 90s, and today. I mean, God, that sounds like a radio station or something. But before we do that, I did want to mention too I had shared an article with the two of you about these 50s horror comics and their influence on Stephen King, like in particular the publisher EC. I mean, he's said for years that was a very big influence on him as a child, and part of what helped influence him to like pursue horror writing as his genre at the beginning. So, did y'all read that one about Stephen King? Or I think I shared two, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, that doesn't surprise me at all. Which is one of the really interesting things I think about. I mean, when you're talking about comic as a literary form anyway, is the accessibility of it. Um, because usually they are, especially if you're buying just single issues, they're relatively inexpensive. And they still, I mean, they always have been, and they still are today. That you can go and you can get one fairly cheaply, and it's easy to just kind of sit down and read. In fact, when my son was first learning to read, that was the thing he gravitated to. Is we would go to the comic book store together, and he would just pick out whatever kind of struck his fancy. Um, of course, I monitored what he was digging into, um, but yeah, I mean, but you can see something like that, how seeing a monster, um, or something monstrous happen to a human, how that could ignite the imagination of somebody, especially like Stephen King. Like, I don't know, just that didn't surprise me in the least, to hear that. But that's a fun fact to learn.
Well, and he talked about a little bit in Dance Macabre as well, as it being an influence on some of his works. I want to say he might have mentioned Salem's Lot, but he also talked about just reading them when he was a kid and how they kind of fired his imagination, which yeah, like makes sense for all the reasons that you were saying, Lisa.
So yeah, just think if the Comics Code Authority had come along earlier or whatever, we might not have the Stephen King that we know and love today, which is a very, very sad thing for me to think about. Well, and speaking of the Comics Code Authority, like one thing that I had kind of wanted to mention too is that starting, and I'm probably going to get the dates wrong, but I want to say it was like towards the late 80s into the early 90s. The main publishers, that being Marvel and DC, had created these offshoot imprints that were still owned by them, but they weren't adhering to the Comics Code Authority. And that's where you started to get those experimental things. Like Sandman was part of Vertigo, and Vertigo was the line of not Comic Code Authority stuff that was owned by DC. So that's how Neil Gaiman was able to sort of appropriate this like 1930s or 40s pulp character called the Sandman and turn it into this amazing, insane work of genius about mythology and whatnot. But so much of the stuff that it like thematically did and dealt with, and there was, you know, violence and everything else. I mean, none of that would have flown for the Comics Code Authority approved stuff. And since it was like they were able to do it because it's self-regulation, you know, there was nobody outside saying we're the Comics Code Authority, you can't do this. It was just DC, Marvel, and everybody else agreeing to do it. So they just kind of politely agreed not to for some of their works. But like you were talking about Lisa Preacher, that you were talking about Preacher, Lisa, that was another Vertigo one, if I'm not mistaken. God, don't.
Yeah, it was.
I knew it was on one of the imprints, and I was going to say, comic fans, please don't get me wrong. It's kind of late in the evening at the end of a long week for me, so my brain's kind of a little mushy. But yeah, I knew it was on one of them. I couldn't remember if it was the Marvel or DC. But yeah, like Vertigo was where DC would kind of let their creative talent like really do stuff that would not fly. Like Superman's always going to be Superman. Batman's going to be dark with an edge, but he's never going to kill. But hey, here's Vertigo. Let's have, you know, a comic about serial killers or something. You know, something that would not really pass in their main lines.
You know, that's what I find so fascinating about comics in general, and this is why I want to go and do a really deep dive into the history behind it, because I think there is kind of an underground feeling to some of these, and it's kind of the way you're describing like Neil Gaiman with his Sandman, right? Like, we're gonna kind of do our own thing. We're not gonna worry about what tradition is or what the, you know, even though they are kind of under the big guys, they're not under the big guys at the same time, like you were saying. And I think that's interesting, because I think some of the comics that, I mean, like Preacher is probably a good example, that were doing the kind of weirdest things, and I mean that in the best way. It was kind of one of these things that was happening over on the fringes, and it was not mainstream. And it was more of people kind of sharing it, like, hey, look at this thing I'm reading, look at this thing I found. That was separate from the mainstream, you know, because mainstream comics, they were still doing, and I think about, and by mainstream, I mean what was going out to the mainstream audience, like Superman, right? Because that was being made into all the movies. Batman was being made into all the movies. And then over here on the side, you have people being like, hey, read this Sandman thing, or read this Preacher thing. You know, look at what's going on over here. Which is kind of neat, because and maybe this is where I think horror fits in so well with that, is that it does enjoy exploiting those boundaries a little bit, for lack of a better word. You know, now that I think about it, and I will go ahead and say I apologize to our listeners, because I did not think through this thesis before. I'm going to say it here now. But there seems to be a trend of, you know, some really cool ideas happening in comic books, and then they get adapted to, well, usually to the screen, you know, either the big screen, the big movie theater screen, or the tiny screen for your television. And it's not always great when that happens. This is not horror at all, but I had read a story, or like an article on the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, of all things. Like I said, it's not horror, but apparently when that comic started in the 80s, which I think it came out in like 84 or 85, or I don't know, when I was too young to really be reading what was happening. But it was basically what we would consider like a self-published thing. somebody just a couple of friends had this idea, they put it out there, and from what I understand, because I have not read any of them, any of the original ones, but it was kind of to use that to repeat the same phrase I've been repeating this whole episode, pushing the boundaries. But it's kind of dark, and it was kind of edgy, and it was kind of gritty, and then it got turned into a kid's cartoon on Nickelodeon, which is what I remember. And it was like plastered on every plastic toy you could find. And all I remember of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is they ate a lot of pizza, and I think they skateboarded. But now I want to know what the original ones were, what those were like, if they really were this kind of darker, grittier version. But anyway, that's all just to say that it seems like there is this trend of comics that are kind of pushing into those darker places, and those and it is something to kind of be shifted under the table, so to speak, and like, hey, look at this, don't show anybody else, but kind of look at this thing. And then by the time it makes it to the big screen, it's been really watered down. And I mean, maybe I'm thinking about some of the newer things. I don't know, if I hope I'm not offending anybody when I say this, but maybe something like The Walking Dead, or some of these. I don't know. What do you guys think about that? Do you think when these comics get adapted, does it water it down? Does it change it at all?
Mel, I'll let you go first before I chime in with my thoughts if you want.
I don't know. My thoughts are so inchoate on this. I feel like even though comics and graphic novels are a very visual medium, that when you turn something into a movie or a television program, you have such different constraints. You have different audience constraints. You have different constraints with who might be financing the process. And you also might approach the visuals maybe in a different manner because you're using video and not necessarily an artistic rendering with, words kind of used to bolster what's going on. I mean, that's my initial thought, is that you're switching genres. So there's going to be some sort of artistic difference in interpretation, even if you tried to stay close to something.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And this has nothing to do with horror, but there is an anime TV series called Full Metal Alchemist. Well, there's actually two of them, and the reason is that it was based on a manga, which this Japanese version of comic books. They have lots of very similar things, but then they also have some of their own very defining characteristics. But that's neither here nor there. The interesting thing was that the first anime TV series of Full Metal Alchemist ended up catching up to the manga because the manga was still being written and produced, and so then they had to start making their own stuff, like telling their own story. It's kind of like what happened with Game of Thrones, where they caught up and passed up George R.R. Martin and had to write their own ending, so to speak. Much like the last season of Game of Thrones, that original anime of Full Metal Alchemist is not usually liked. It's Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, which is the one that's actually based on the ending of the manga that people really like a lot better, because it's truer to the source material. But I'll be honest, sometimes you can change things from the source material and make them better as well. I would never be the one that would say that the source material is pure and holy and completely untouchable. I love the film adaptation of V for Vendetta. It's very different from the comic book, basically in the second half of it, but I love it for what it is. It's very different. That being said, yeah, I mean, talking about adapting, I keep coming back to Walking Dead since you mentioned it, and that is probably one of the most well-known adaptations from comic book to small screen. And it was very true to the comic in the beginning. It made its own divergences and differences in choices, but they were usually smaller, and then it started veering further and further away. And I don't know, the show kind of just lost its footing for its own reasons there that I'm not going to get into, I guess. But yeah, I think I think, like Mel said, you've got very different constraints when you're trying to go from comic to visual medium. Um, well, like, you know, when I say visual medium, I guess, film, TV. For one, you've got to actually have actors and whatnot, and sets, and even all the CGI in the world can't can't replace some things, or can't create some worlds, I guess. Not as well as they should be if they're really well done in comics.
Yeah, I mean, I enjoyed The Walking Dead. I enjoyed the TV show. I enjoyed all of it. I agree with you, Matt. I think it went on maybe a bit too long. Um,
It sort of in strayed away from the original vision. Let's put it that way.
well, and we won't turn this into a discussion about the TV show or anything, but I
No.
do think something like that is difficult, like you said, to sustain for so long, because eventually the conflicts are going to be resolved, and then you have to find new conflicts, and I think that's difficult for any TV show. I think that's why I struggle. Everybody says we're in the golden age of television, which I agree, but I think we need to bring back the idea of a limited series too, because sometimes when things go on forever, it just starts to fray around the edges.
Yeah, absolutely. When when I heard they were turning World War Z into a film, I was immediately happy, and then the more I heard about it, the more I was like, well, I have to let go of expectations, or else I'll just be sad and disappointed. But my perfect idea for adapting that book into some sort of visual thing would be a 5 or 6 part mini series. Like, it's the only way to tell that entire story properly, and you can only really tell the story without omitting things. Like, the story is so much of it is so layered and intricate that it has to you have to be very careful what you'd remove, or else you'd ruin it. But I digress. um, well, I guess we're sort of starting to run down the clock, so to speak. I did just kind of want to give a shout out to some of the more modern horror comics. Many of them are still being published in some form or another, but for those of you who may not be as well versed in comics as you are maybe in movies or TV shows or books, I mean, probably one of the more well-known ones would be Mike Mignola's Hellboy. Great comic, just all around fun. um, Hellblazer with John Constantine is, well, it's been going on as a series off and on for a while, probably since the 80s, and there's some really great story arcs in there. uh, I cannot I'm drawing a complete blank, and I wish I had written it down. My favorite one of them, that was sort of the basis for the Constantine movie, but they really didn't do a good job with it. um, but there's a story arc by Constantine, and I mean, he's, if you've seen the Constantine movie or the very short-lived TV show, you'd be familiar. He's kind of like a Sherlock Holmes mixed with Harry Potter mixed with Hunter S. Thompson, I guess. not with the drugs, but just the sarcastic attitude and chain smoking, I guess. So, uh, and then the last one from my list, which did get adapted into an excellent film, if you like horror movies, which I assume you do. And seeing as how it's October, maybe if you haven't seen it, go check out 30 Days of Night. Not all the sequels to it in graphic novel form, they are varying quality, and most of them are not great, but the first one's really good, and that was the basis for the movie, which I really liked as well. So it's one of the few things that I've seen Josh Hartnett in that I didn't just roll my eyes at. So
Sorry. um yeah, I'll have to, I've read The Walking Dead. I have not read 30 Days of Night, so I'll have to add that to my list. I mean, I know I've mentioned Preacher before, and I've mentioned Emily Carroll's Through the Woods, which is more like a collection of short stories than a real true comic, but I still stand by that choice. And one series that I love that's relatively new is Nailbiter, um, which is an Image comic, and it's it's about a small town, I think in Oregon, that has produced the most serial killers ever. Like just the most serial killers ever to have been born in one place. And so um the name nail biter comes from one of the particular serial killers who likes to bite the nails of his victims. But it also covers all the other ones, and it follows these detectives as they're so anyway, it's just it's a really good for people who enjoy the kind of horror, you know, police hunting down serial killers, because this literally gives you a town full of them, which I thought was a really neat kind of twist, and it's fun. It's really well done. A friend of mine, my who I mentioned earlier, who had sent me all these comics, my friend Emily, she recommended, and I have not read this one yet, but it's next on my list. Is Y the Last Man, which is science
Yes,
fiction. Is it good?
yes.
Is
That
it?
when I said top three comics, Why the Last Man is the third one.
Oh, good. Okay. So that's next on my list. But then since y'all mentioned enjoying Lock and Key, because I had forgotten about this one, but as we were talking, I remembered Tales from the Dark Side is it's Joe Hill, and he did one with Rodriguez, who did the art for Lock and Key. They did a Tales from the Dark Side out from IDW. Um, that's pretty fun. So I don't know. Those are some of the newer ones I've been enjoying. And Matt, now I'm really super excited. I mean, I was already excited to read Why the Last Man, but apparently from what I know about it, it's like science fictiony and post apocalyptic, and I'm really really looking forward to it.
It hits all the right notes and it's excellent. And if you don't cry at the end of it, you're made of stone. So
Oh, good. Okay, well then I know I will. Oh, and I'll also mention one I've been having a lot of fun with is it's called Lady Killer. And it's about like a female assassin, and it's super fun. So, yeah, those are what I've been reading lately, so for what it's worth.
Well, I'm writing down Why the Last Man right now. So
yeah, I don't own a lot of graphic novel collections or trade paperback collections, I guess is what they call them, where they take smaller issues and collect them into bigger volumes. But I have the entire run of Why the Last Man. That's one of the few ones that I own the entire series of because it's that good. So
Oh,
for what it's worth, that's my recommendation.
okay.
I've heard great things about Saga, but I have not read any of it.
Well, Saga is also by Brian K. Vaughan, as is Paper Girls. So
Mm-hmm.
if you like Paper Girls,
Love Paper Girls.
there's then which I have not read. I have had recommended, but I have not read. Uh, but yeah, if you like Paper Girls, I can only imagine that you'll like Saga and uh, what's it called? Why the Last Man? I don't know why I'm drawing a blank on the thing that we're talking about.
All right, well, that's probably a good place for us to stop because my to be read list just keeps getting longer and longer and longer, as I'm sure our listeners' lists are as well. So, with that said, this is just a quick reminder that your co host Lisa and I wrote a book. From gothic ghost stories to psychological horror to science fiction, women have been the primary architects of dark speculative literature of all sorts. So satisfy your craving for extraordinary authors and exceptional fiction. Meet the women writers who defied convention to craft some of literature's strangest tales in a new nonfiction book, Monsters She Wrote. The book is out now, and you can order it now by going to the Quirk Books website or through any major book retailer. And we would love to hear from you here at the No Fear Cast. We're at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram. We have a Facebook page. If you'd like to contact us by email, we love getting emails. We've gotten a few lately. It's great to hear from folks. So please send us an email if you'd like at nofearcast@gmail.com. If you love what we are doing, consider supporting us on Patreon and get access to exclusive content. So every other week, in the weeks between our main episodes, we have shorter mini episodes that you can have access to for $5 a month on Patreon. Or, in order to help us out, if you just want to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, which is entirely free, that would be awesome as well. Through all the Apple algorithms, it helps other people find us. As always, thanks for listening, and we will be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.